Hello everyone. In the Bizzaro list of statistics and measures provided by Federal Reserve, trimmed mean inflation is another addition. So before we go through this article, let's try to understand what trimmed mean inflation is, and then we'll come back to it. So this is the website, this is the St. Louis Fed website, and trimmed mean PCE inflation rate is 2.81 as of November 2021. Now this was updated December 23rd, 2021. So yeah, what Fed says about PCE, trimmed PCE? The trimmed mean PCE inflation rate produced by Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas is an alternative measure of core inflation in the price index for personal consumption expenditures. Now, some of you may be familiar, was the CPI is another way of calculating consumer inflation. PCE is another price index which is different from CPI, and that is also used to calculate inflation. And now they have come up with this trimmed mean PCE, which is an alternate way of calculating PCE. Um, so in summary, there used to be CPI, then they created PCE, that's the preferred method, and now they're going to this trimmed mean PCE because PCE now is not fulfilling the narrative. So data series is calculated by Dallas Fed using data from Bureau of Economic Analysis, BEA. Calculating the trimmed mean PCE inflation rate for a given month involves looking at the price changes for each of the individual component of personal consumption expenditure. The individual price changes are sorted in ascending order from fell the most to the rose the most, and a certain fraction of the most extreme observations at the both ends of the spectrum are thrown out or trimmed. The inflation rate is then calculated as a weighted average of the remaining components. Now, so what does this all mean? What Federal Reserve is saying is they list down all the components involved into personal consumption expenditure. So they create a list in an ascending order where at the top are the most deflationary items, i.e., prices reduced, and then at the bottom is the most inflationary items, that means the price is increased. In that list, they remove the topmost and the bottommost items from calculation. Whatever is left in the middle, they create a average of that, weighted average of that, and then the outcome is the PCE number or trimmed mean PCE number. Trimmed mean inflation rate is a proxy for true core PCE inflation rate. So according to them, trimmed mean inflation is proxy for a true PCE inflation rate. Resulting inflation measure has been shown to outperform the more conventional excluding food and energy measure as a gauge of core inflation. So according to them, this one is a better indicator in gauging core inflation. And I will show you shortly that they are actually still excluding food and energy from calculating this PCE or trimmed PCE as well. So this statement is not quite accurate. Now going back to the article, trimmed mean inflation is the ultimate absurdity in inflation measures. Couldn't agree more. Now here's the chart showing CPI, PCE, and trimmed PCE. So CPI is the highest, then PCE, and now they have come up with this trimmed mean PCE 2.8 to basically indicate, guys, nothing to see here. Um, Everything is fine, inflation is low. Um, a Dallas Fed working paper offers this assessment. Trimmed mean inflation is the superior communications and policy tool because it is a less biased real time estimator of headline inflation and because it more successfully filters out headline inflation's transitory variations, leaving only cyclical and trend components. So, as you guys probably are familiar, Federal Reserve have been caught recently with their pants down as far as inflation goes. Inflation, even though was sustained, they have been saying it was transitory, and and now they have come up with this alternative measure to weed out inflation transitory variations and only give you trend components, which is nothing but, you know, lies. Is just fudging figures and data to um, sell the narrative, which is inflation is low, really. Now, we just went through this, but let's go through this again. Essentially, the Dallas Fed says let's throw out the top and bottom items of PCE and average the rest. PCE stands for Personal Consumption Indicators and is the Fed's preferred measure of inflation. So PCE is preferred over CPI. PCE differs from CPI in that it counts expenses paid on behalf of consumers, such as medical insurance. So it looks like PCE includes medical insurance, whereas CPI probably doesn't. Or if it does include insurance paid on behalf of consumers, medical insurance to be precisely, um, the weight provided is lower, relatively lower. The consumer price index weighs rent much higher than PCE, which in turn weighs medical higher. So yeah, just what I explained. A consumer CPI or CPI weighs rent higher, whereas PCE weighs medical higher. This is the list of items that are used to calculate trimmed PCE. And if you go to this link, you will get to Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas website. If you scroll down, there is this link, components included and excluded from month's trimmed mean, and you get this list. Now, yellow is highlighted by me, but all the top items are red, which are indicating low inflation or deflation. Items in the green are inflation or high inflation. Again, yellow is highlighted by me. And the items that are in the middle, this orangish one, are the one used to calculate that trimmed mean PCE. Now, these first four, food supplied to military, higher education school lunches, elementary and secondary school lunches, food supplied to civilian, it deflated by almost 50%, annualized 1 month change. I'm not sure how they came up with that, but let's assume this is because, you know, food wasn't being supplied to military personnel in their barracks or wherever they stay. Similarly, school lunches weren't provided in either schools or unis because kids were staying at home. But if there is a deflation in these items, there should be an equivalent inflation in the food items elsewhere because it's not like that lunches weren't being consumed. It's just that those individuals weren't consuming them at their regular location. They were consuming them elsewhere. But I couldn't find the corresponding inflation in these items reflected in here. Uh, as we just um, as we just know that medical is given more weightage over rents in trimmed PCE, which is reflected here. So weightage for this paramedical services is high, but the inflation was very low, and yet they have excluded it. Similarly, new light trucks, high inflation, high weight, excluded. New light trucks, high inflation, high weight, excluded. Food products, high inflation, high weight, excluded. Used light trucks, high inflation, high rate, excluded. Gas and motor fuel, extreme high inflation, very high weight, excluded. Air transportation, high inflation, medium weight, excluded. Pork, high inflation, excluded. Fruits, high inflation, excluded. Fats and oils, high inflation, excluded. Other meats, high inflation, excluded. Railroad and water transportation, high inflation, excluded. Beef and veal, high inflation, excluded. Poultry, high inflation, medium weight, excluded. Fresh milk, high inflation, excluded. So all these things we consume every day in our life, and these are all food and energy items I just listed or went through, and they are excluded from calculation. So I'm not sure where they are coming up with the statements that you know conventional measures were the one excluding food and energy. That's not the case. Even this one is excluding. So ultimately, the Dallas Fed discarded 56.57% of entire PCE, heavily weighted by discarding high inflation items to arrive at a preposterous 2.8% year over year measure of inflation. 100%. And that's the bottom line. So they are discarding high inflation, high weighted, heavily weighted items, and that's why they are coming up with this such a low number. So they are basically manipulating the data to sell the narrative. So yep, another addition into the list of Bizzaro measures, Bizzaro statistics from Fed. Thanks for listening. Share, subscribe, and comment, and I will see you in the next one.